9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. And as you know, periodically when we see a book that we think you really ought to read, we try to get the author to come in and talk to us about it. And this is one of those occasions. We're really pleased to be joined by Lindsay Chervinsky. She is a presidential historian and executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Her latest book is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Hi, Lindsay. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am a longtime Deep State Radio nerd, and so this is very exciting.
Well, I hope we don't sort of ruin the luster of all of that here. But let me start maybe not in the place that you would think we were going to start. But I was looking through one of the reviews of your books and of this book, the book is called Making the Presidency: John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. But I'm just going to read some of this, and it's from Kirkus, and then I'm going to ask you a question. But it says here, as the author describes in impressive depth, Adams was essentially flying blind when he took the oath of office upon succeeding the universally lauded yet aloof George Washington in the first transfer of executive power in U.S. history. Despite a total lack of executive experience, Adams had to demonstrate that the presidency could operate without Washington and negotiate partisan machinations among Federalists and Republicans inside and outside the administration, particularly those of his rival, while meeting potential threats from Europe that could severely wound the fledgling republic. Now, the review goes on and it says a lot of nice things, including that the book is a significant contribution to the history of the American presidency. But, typically when we look at histories, we try to draw connections to the present. And when I was reading, succeeding an aloof president, lack of executive experience, demonstrating the presidency could operate in a situation where there was a lot of political division, the threat from a very prominent rival, a lot of threats from around the world, and also, as it happens, the kind of volatile moment in the history of the country. I thought of Joe Biden. It sounds a lot like the situation that Joe Biden was in. And while I'm pretty sure that wasn't your intention, I just thought I'd start there and see what you thought of in terms of the resonances of then to now.
Well, I love that you brought that up. It is not what everyone has asked me about, but the parallels between the 1790s and today are really extraordinary in terms of weak parties and very intense partisanship, the threat of foreign interference in our elections, contested elections, political violence, pandemics, questions about citizenship and who belongs, and xenophobia and immigration. I mean, just the parallels go on and on. But I think the Joe Biden connection is a really interesting one because one of John Adams' greatest contributions is knowing that he was going to have a terrible time. Whoever came after Washington was going to just absolutely have a miserable time in office because they were going to fail in comparison to Washington. And there were all of these sort of unanswered questions. And while the circumstances are obviously a little bit different for Biden, he was coming in the middle of a pandemic with a teetering economy and very shortly thereafter, the war in Europe. And I think it would be fair to say that he kind of knew he was going to have a terrible time too. And sometimes
he had a kind of aloof predecessor who didn't really involve him as much in the vice presidency as we often think he did.
That's a really good way to put it. And so I think a lot of times what we don't always, showing up and doing something that is not going to be fun or popular is not nearly as sexy as winning a civil war. It's not nearly as sexy as winning World War II. It's not always what is going to get you a statue in Washington, D.C., but it's really quite essential.
Now, John Adams, obviously, he is a Titan, and there have been many great books written about him, and his character has appeared in a variety of different formats. Paul Giamatti and on HBO, and the obnoxious and disliked John Adam of the musical 1776, the personality of this guy is very interesting because he was a kind of isolated figure, and yet he was absolutely essential to getting to the Declaration of Independence, to getting to, a functioning republic, to providing the transition from the guy that everybody had just thought, why don't we just make him king? Right? It was kind of like,
king, but an all but name.
Right, but it was kind of like, let's let George Washington run the show. It's simple. And all of a sudden, going from, and there's a lot of talk been recently because people say, well, isn't it interesting Joe Biden did the most selfless act since George Washington, which I think is kind of an extraordinary overstatement. But there's a lot of talk about that right now. And of course, half of the miracle of that transition is done by Washington. But if Adams hadn't picked up the ball, where would we be?
It's a great point. And I do think I should start by saying that I think his personality gets a little bit of a bad rap. And that's partly because two of the all-time greatest propagandists that the United States has ever produced, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, were writing about him. And were often writing about him for very political reasons and wanting people to think that he was erratic and impossible and difficult. And sometimes he could be stubborn. Sometimes he could be rash. He was certainly obstinate, but those sometimes can be really important, essential qualities, to your point about pushing for independence, even when he was one of the few voices, pushing for neutrality when it was really essential the United States stay out of war, pushing for American sovereignty as a diplomat. And then once he was in the presidency, that independence of spirit, the independence of mind was really quite essential and allowed him to make choices that he knew were going to be politically unpopular and were probably going to lose him support in the party, but were the right thing to do. And most importantly, I think that was the beginning and the end, and it's the peaceful transfer of power. And you're right. And we have seen recently that it really takes two to tango. You have to have two people, two sides who are committed to the peaceful transfer of power. Otherwise, it does not work. And Adams is the common denominator in both of those.
Yeah, it is hard to minimize, and we shouldn't minimize the contributions of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. But having said that, it's also hard to deny that they were, you said, biggest propagandists. They were kind of major league assholes, and they, I don't think people quite get how bad things were back then. We have our own politics, but Thomas Jefferson actually hired a dude to go work in the State Department to write nasty pamphlets about Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton did the same thing, and they spread rumors about each other's sex lives, and it was horrible. And somehow in the middle of all of this, you have John Adams, who gets this bad rap, but he's got this stable family. He's got this really important wife who he's constantly relying on throughout this whole thing. He's, there's all these people doing all this crazy stuff around him, shooting people, being shot, all this other kind of thing. And Adams, Adams is the glue. And we should note the transition in 1796, even though Washington was kind of aloof and didn't really do him any favors, was way better than 1800 because of the tension between Jefferson and Adams.
Yeah, it was. I think what the transition about 1796 for me, what is so important is they didn't know what was coming next. So, we can read history backwards, but they did not know. And for them, this was the first peaceful transfer of power that they had ever experienced. And this was at the age of the French Revolution. So they're reading about transfers of power that are going very, very badly. And so when Washington attended the inauguration and handed over power to Adams and it went smoothly, people talked about it as though it was the most sublime thing that had ever happened in American history. I'm using their language. And tears were running down the faces of everyone present because of its rarity in American history. And that required a great deal of intention and a great deal of care to set that up, because none of it was written down. The Constitution doesn't say anything about how that's supposed to work. And none of the statutes that we rely on today, or even the sort of guidelines that monitor how a transition is supposed to go, none of that was written down. So it really depended on the people there. But I just wanted to circle back to one very terrible thing that Jefferson did, though you were discussing all of his various machinations. While he was vice president, he was meeting with the French minister, encouraging France not to sign a peace treaty with the United States, because he said he would be in office a couple years later and would get them a better deal. So he was basically encouraging France to continue to steal American ships and imprison American sailors and seize American goods and to do whatever to John Adams while he was vice president. Like, that is insane behavior. And somehow that sometimes gets missed.
But I disagree. It's not insane behavior. It was a tradition that has now been held up many times in American history. Richard Nixon did it with the Vietnam War. Ronald Reagan did it with the hostages.
But they were candidates. They weren't the vice president.
No, I understand. I'm just saying there is a long tradition. And,
that's true.
We have a former president who seems to have been on the horn to Bibi Netanyahu saying, hey, Bibi, let's not have a solution right now. Let's wait. We don't want to give them that big win. So, Jefferson was, I'm kidding a little bit, but the other thing, though, that I think comes out of all of that is people don't fully understand how fragile all of this was at that time. Remember, we'd gone through not just a revolution, but sort of you know this, but I'm just saying for the benefit of the audience. But then we'd gone through the Confederation period, which didn't really work. Now we had Washington. There was some degree of stability, but there was a lot of tension, particularly around this issue of, loyalty to England versus affinity to France. And so in the middle of Adams' presidency, the Alien and Sedition Act, which it's kind of a big deal, and I don't think most people understand it. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that fragility is so important, because the Constitution was really the country's second chance, and most republics don't get second chances. And we know, I think instinctually, but studies bear this out, that it's really easy to tear things down. It's really hard to build things. And so the fact that this country was really only in its second decade, and it was this brand new thing that they were trying to build, there was just this pervasive fear that any one misstep would tear the entire thing apart, and it would completely descend into anarchy and violence, not unlike the French Revolution. And so that context is really quite essential for the Alien and Sedition Acts, because when it seemed likely that France was going to declare war on the United States in the summer of 1798, Congress did a number of very sensible things, like created a naval department and a navy, a proper navy for the first time, built up coastal defenses, expanded the army, things like that. That makes sense. And then they passed a series of 4 bills. And some of those, it bears actually worth talking about each in piece, because they have different motivations. The Naturalization Act made it much harder for immigrants to come into the country and to become citizens. It changed the period of time of naturalization from 5 to 14 years. And this was because most immigrants voted for the Democratic Republicans. And so the Federalists really didn't want them to be citizens. The Alien Enemy Act was a bill that was passed that said if war was declared, then with all appropriate due process, they could export foreign nationals from the nation that they were at war with. So that type of bill is actually quite sensible. We've had one on the books ever since then. In times of war, it's been used. Then they passed the Alien Friends Act, which basically said that the president can deport whoever they want at will without any due process. That bill is insane. The last bill is the sedition bill, and it made it illegal to criticize Congress or to criticize the president and to encourage anyone to basically oppose any act of government. Now, it should be said that John Adams did not ask for any of these bills. He did not sort of, try and curry support or whip votes for any of them, but he did sign them. Now, to his credit, he did not actually use any of the power given to him under the Alien Friends Act to export anyone. He didn't export a single person. However, he did kind of accept and maybe encourage and even enjoy some of the prosecutions against some of the most vociferous newspaper editors. Although I do think one thing is worth noting. At the time, there was not the sort of jurisprudence or legal code that we have today that says you don't have the right to use speech that provokes violence. Like, that is a protection that we count as to be quite important. So newspaper editors just printed lies and often did encourage violence. And so I do think there was a good base fear, but then it was used for very partisan aims.
Yeah, but, most people, we all like to think we live in the most special time in history. I call it temporal narcissism. We just think this is where it's all. And there are some reasons to believe that in American history, this is particularly bad. Donald Trump recently been assessed by historians as the worst president in our history. He's a criminal. He stole national secrets. He, we don't have to sort of litigate each aspect of it. He's kind of awful guy. And we talk about the depth of the divisions in the United States right now. But I think it's useful for people to keep in mind that the divisions in the United States are also a kind of historical tradition from the beginning, from the difference between the Democratic Republicans, who are closely tied to the views of the agricultural South, and the Federalists, who are closely tied to the views of the more industrializing North, through the Civil War, which was the great manifestation of that conflict, through to divisions that have existed between the Jim Crow South and the North today. But this period you write about here is not just a period about the making of the presidency. It's a period about the making of the kind of precedents for the models of how our democracy works and is dysfunctional both.
Yes. No, I think that's such a good point. I think one of the things that I find to be very useful about history is it actually tells us what is unprecedented. And that is super useful to know what we haven't experienced before. And you're right, this period of intense partisanship, the real division, the sense that everything is seen through a polarized lens, including like healthcare choices and culture and styles of dress. Those were things that were also politicized in the 1790s. And so, they say, historians like to say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this is a really great example of a lot of those things in the 1790s were rhyming with today, and how Americans grappled with them at the time. Maybe they don't have the same technology. Maybe they don't have, running water and social media. So it looks a little different. But the question about, what do you do in a moment of constitutional crisis applies. And 1800 was the first real constitutional crisis where they had to figure out if it would survive and if there would be a peaceful transfer of power and if there would be an election and what was the role for average citizens, what was the role for the president in those things. And they had to figure it out.
When you look at the period, obviously you set out to write this book with intent, right? What was the intent? What was the message you felt we needed now?
Well, when I first started researching it, it was in 2020. And my goal was very different than it became the next year. So in early 2021, after January 6th, I realized how much I was taking for granted the peaceful transfer of power as the bedrock of democratic institutions, and how fragile they are, and how much regular upholding and participation and buy-in is required from citizens. And so I wanted to both understand how those institutions came to be, because Washington was such a unique, he really had created the presidency, but he was such a unique figure. There was never going to be anyone like him again. So Adams had to figure out what the presidency looked like for everyone else. And so I wanted to explain that. But then I also wanted to make very clear that these things are not permanent, and they require a certain level of attention to maintain them, and a certain intentionality to maintain them. And I wanted to demonstrate that in moments of crisis, it is not military genius. It is not military valor or insane acts of brilliance. It is just people putting the Constitution above their own political or partisan aims. And that is actually, it might feel like a big ask, but it's actually a relatively small act. And the people who made the biggest difference in 1800, many of them are not names that most people remember. Most of them are historical footnotes, and they were often quite young congressmen in their 30s and 40s, just doing the right thing. And so that, I felt like, was a really essential message for hopefully all of American history, but especially for this coming fall.
What I know from writing books, particularly historical books, that, you spend a lot of time alone in the room with the subject of your book, and they take over real estate in your brain. And I'm just wondering, what's the state of your relationship with John Adams at the moment?
It's actually really good. The thing about John Adams is that a lot of his contemporaries found him to be an anathema, but the things that sort of confused them make him very accessible to us. He was very self-deprecating. He was very aware of his own flaws. He made fun of them. He was funny and had a sense of humor. And his relationship with his wife was extraordinary, which you alluded to. The best decision he ever made was his wife, and her contribution
the
to
letters between the two of them. There was a book of them published at one point. I think it was called Dear Friend, right? And because so many of the letters began that way.
They called each other a dearest friend. And
I found it incredibly moving.
It's so moving, because even when they had been married for over 3 decades, there was still such incredible tenderness and fondness, but such intellectual power. Abigail did not have the same sort of formal education he did. She was mostly self-educated, but she was so savvy and so politically astute. And so I highly recommend people take a look at them, because most people know her for the Remember the Ladies letter, and it's a great letter, but it's really quite average for her, because she just has these incredible lines. And so, people say, Washington or Adams, and I say, respect Washington, love Adams.
Well, it's such a, I don't think people fully get quite how small the country was then. Mm-hmm. And, in those letters, during the Revolution, Abigail Adams is writing about, making saltpeter for the troops, mm-hmm. and they're talking about making, it's just a handful of people, a handful of families, a handful of that really sort of pull the cart here. Right. It's, it's the size of, what is it, 13 million people when it starts? It's the size of sort of greater New York, right?
Yeah. It's super tiny. It's super tiny. New York itself was super tiny. I was looking so in the book on page 22, I created a map of Philadelphia, which was where the government was located for most of Adams' presidency. And what's great about Philadelphia is that the grid is still the same as it was. So you can really kind of figure out where people were, and they were all clustered in the old part of town. And what I love about it is Philadelphia in the 1790s was more dense than New York City was before the pandemic. So they were all like right on top of each other. And some of the figures in the book absolutely loathed one another, and they lived like right across the street from one another. And it demonstrates both the smallness in terms of the number of people. You're right. It's a couple of families. There's a lot of overlap. They all know each other. They all know each other's family. They all know the secrets. They go to the same bookstore and they go to the same post office and they go to the same tailor and they get, they go to the same places, but they also cannot escape each other when they're in these cities. And so there is no escaping from the person you don't want to see because they are right there.
Yeah, and in Philadelphia at the time, there were there weren't 100 or two. There weren't thousands of families. There were dozens of families, and some of them were loyalists, and in fact, some of them ended up being in the middle of some of the big spy plots of the Revolutionary War, but also behind the rivalries between Hamilton and Burr and so forth, which just go back to, who knew who stayed with who knew what family and so forth. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Boston and New York were cities of several tens of thousands of people. They're the size of small towns today.
Yeah, no, it was really quite small. So, for example, a statistic that I think is helpful, Pennsylvania was a major swing state in the election of 1796 and 1800. So some things do not change. About 13% of the population of Pennsylvania was able to vote. So really only white men of property. And there were about 12,000 voters in the state. So when you were trying to get out the vote, what some of the committees would do, because at the time when you cast your vote for the electors for electoral college, you had to list a ballot with all of the names, and it had to be in handwriting. But the handwriting didn't have to match the signature. So the committees would fill out these ballots with all of the names of the electors, and they made over 12,000 copies of them so they could hand them out to every single voter, and then all they had to do was do their signature at the bottom. So that's what electioneering looked like in 1796 and 1800. So it's a little bit different in terms of size and scope.
Yeah. What was that Reese Witherspoon movie? Election? What was the movie?
Oh, the high school one?
Yes.
Sometimes not dissimilar strategies.
Right. It echoes a little bit. When you talk to people about this now, what are the messages that you try to convey to contemporary voters facing contemporary issues?
So the first is that politics in the United States has always been messy. It's always been nasty. And the people that are involved in it have always been conniving and flawed, even the greatest minds. I think that is actually super comforting because it allows us to not feel like we've fallen quite so far. The second is that the most important thing in any crisis is understanding that the survival of the republic and the survival of the Constitution is going to mean that not everyone gets what they want. And so people have to put the Constitution above their own partisan aims, which I define as civic virtue. Sometimes that's just how it goes in a republic. You don't always win. And then I think the last thing that I would say is they very much understood that the Constitution and the institutions were just a starting place. It was just what they wrote down as a stopgap, a series of compromises to try and give the nation a firm foundation. But they firmly expected that people were going to continue to try and evolve and improve on what they started, and that they knew there were things that they had not solved, problems they had not solved, loopholes they had not closed. And very quickly, they tried to close some of those. So, the 12th Amendment was passed in 1803 to resolve the conundrum that led to the tie in 1800. And they expected future generations to do the same. And so by us not doing that, by us not trying to continue trying to improve, we are abandoning that legacy.
Yeah, I think that is a great message, because people talk about the country a little bit like it was Athena springing full grown out of the forehead of Zeus, right? And it was not. I mean, it wasn't even clear what the role of the judiciary was until arguably 1803, right? Marbury versus
Yeah.
Madison, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the judiciary was kind of like a, TBD post-it note in the Constitution. And then in the summer of 1789, they actually passed legislation creating it. And then Marbury versus Madison is what actually says, actually, this is our purpose. But that was, Marshall's creation.
Yeah. And that gets back to the families, right? Because
It does.
John Marshall was the cousin of Thomas Jefferson. He was appointed by John Adams, and they hated each other.
Hated. And it must have really annoyed Thomas Jefferson that he had to take the oath of office from John Marshall because he was the Chief Justice, and that Adams had appointed him, and Adams appointed him knowing that he would want to serve for a while. And then basically Marshall spent the rest of his tenure figuring out ways to kind of thwart Jefferson.
Yeah. And it, like, because I wrote this book on traitors, right? So I did deal a little bit with big traitors, right? And one of the big traitors is Aaron Burr, not because he shoots Alexander Hamilton, but because he tries to lop off a chunk of the country and start his own little empire. And there was this sort of competition between Jefferson, who hated Burr for his own reasons, as this vice president, right? And Marshall, who would it was like, who gets to prosecute this guy, right? And there was this fight between the two of them, which is kind of describes their relationship down to a T, because they never could get along.
Well, and that was kind of like their second round, because their first round had actually occurred a couple of years earlier when, at Jefferson's insistence, the House tried to impeach and remove one of the other justices, who Marshall didn't particularly like his jurisprudence. He didn't think he was a great judge, but he worried that, his name was Samuel Chase, he worried that it was going to set the precedent that if you could remove basically a justice for political reasons. And so he worked really hard to try and undermine Jefferson's attempts at impeachment and was successful. So they actually had like several rounds in which Marshall usually got the upper hand.
Yeah, thanks, John, because that's really left us not the best position now regarding the Supreme Court, and fewer, and also, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember. There was the Dartmouth College decision, which began the process. I think it was 1822. I think Marshall was still around. But it began the tradition of recognizing the sort of independent rights of corporations versus people. And this began a slippery slope in the United States to where we are today, to where the 14th Amendment has been used more often in defense of the rights of companies than of people. So
it's possible we should not always be applying jurisprudence from when women were not allowed to wear pants and people of color were considered property to today.
Wait, you mean, wait a second, this is kind of radical. Are you saying to me that we probably shouldn't take verbatim the Second Amendment when it referred to muzzle loading rifles that could be fired at the rate of one, projectile a minute, to today when we could do 800 a minute? That's crazy.
Well, I would suggest that's so if you also include the words well-regulated.
Well, yes, before the word militia, by the way, which I think that carries some weight. That carries some weight, though, right? It's like, it's not like whoever gets a gun should be managed and well-regulated. It's like, in order to, the reason we're doing this is so you can have a militia, and which we don't have anymore for perfectly good reasons, right? But at least none that we want. Look, this could go on and on. I'm really enjoying talking to you. There's a lot of history that we can go down. To me, it's always the most interesting period, not just because there were these greats, one after another, the founders, who did the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but then, the first presidents, the Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison. That was a pretty good start. Monroe
had a pretty good run.
Monroe may have been the first middling president, and it took us to Jackson to get to a real creep as president.
That's true.
which was ways down the road as the country developed. But it's a very important, because if you don't know this history, not only are you per Santiana doomed to repeat it, but you may get the impression that a lot of the things that are happening today are brand new. And if you do, you're going to get the wrong impression about how to resolve them. So that's why I think this book, Making the Presidency, is so important. That's why I congratulate you on getting it out
Thank
there,
you.
Lindsay. I encourage everybody to go and to get it and to read it. It's lively. It's a terrific read. Hopefully, maybe we can get you back, because I sort of discovered you when you wrote this book, The Cabinet, because I'd written about cabinets. And I think we're going to have some interesting discussions about that in a couple of months. Although we're having him now, as an expert of the cabinet. What do you think? Elon Musk, RFK Jr.?
They're happening earlier and earlier. I have a lot of thoughts on how one should go about putting together a cabinet. I'm not sure that that would be how I would suggest it. Although there is a long tradition of getting your opponents to drop out and endorse you, so that would be in line, I suppose, with the tradition. But yes, I think we probably have a lot to discuss. Definitely in terms of cabinets, in terms of originalism, and the founding generation more broadly.
Sounds great. I look forward to talking again. For now, thank you, Lindsay.
Thank
You,
you.
everybody. And we'll be back again with more stuff every day. Bye-bye.